Hi everyone, my name's Scott Hartley and I'm here with Hayley Lever, the Chief Executive of GM Moving, for our second conversation, Hayley, around just sharing our experiences around creating the conditions for change around moving more. If you remember last time, we had a little exploration of the why moving matters and the how and what we need to do in terms of creating change around such a complex issue. And today, I think we are going to move on to how do we know if anything's changing? And can we start to observe what is changing that might help us start to think about that outcome that we all dearly want to shift? Would you like to move on to the next slide, please? Just to remind everybody that we really are looking at this interplay between inequality and inactivity and how we can create those conditions for tackling both of these at the same time. And I think what we're going to do today is it's going to start with a little bit of me explaining this wonderful slide that Press Red have borrowed religiously and umpteen times from Greater Manchester, just to get the story going around GM's experience, Greater Manchester's experience in this space, and what we can share to help others. As I've said, we've used this slide a lot, and there's a lot on it, and it can be quite overwhelming at times. But what we love about this slide is it really helps to just show that those outcomes, those population level outcomes around inactivity, around inequalities on the right hand side of this, and that lovely phrase that's come out around they're in our sphere of interest. And what GM have had a number of years at trying to work through is, yeah, but how do we go from what we do to creating change, or trying to understand whether we're creating change in those outcomes in our sphere of interest? So in the middle of this, I guess you've got the Greater Manchester moving theory of change, Hayley, and it would be lovely if you could bring to life how you got to that and how easy and quick that journey was, because I think there's some quite helpful learning in this to be shared. If we can bring it out today, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you use this slide more than I do. It's really good to look at it today, in particular, actually, because today's been a bit of a marker for me. I've been at the Combined Authority meeting this morning, where the latest version of the Memorandum of Understanding with Sport England has been approved, and there was a conversation there around really 7 years on. 7 years ago, I was at the same meeting launching GM Moving, where we had pretty much started with a blank sheet of paper, and we're asking ourselves that question of what is it we need to do, how do we need to do it in order to affect change in that right hand end of that diagram. So it's really good to look at this and reflect on the ways of working, the behaviours, what we're actually doing day to day, and don't just mean our team in that, but the whole system across GM, and then reflecting on the approaches to understanding change and how that has been refined. And the last meeting I had before this today was looking at the latest health evaluation report, and a bit of a taking stock conversation around where are we at with our work around embedding physical activity in health, and what's the latest learning telling us. And I was reminded in that meeting just how this is an action research process. So the biggest thing in terms of understanding what's going on and how change is happening, and what our role in that might be, has been the benefit of having embedded researchers who aren't sitting outside of the work pretending that they can be wholly kind of objective and separate to the work, but to be involved in the action learning cycle. So those positive, that sort of feedback loop, both in terms of the feedback loops of what's changing and what's happening in the system, but the constant feedback loop of doing, learning, reflecting, and iterating forward with the work. And we started, and we'll come on to this in a minute, but we started pretty much with a blank sheet of paper and a really good short, but so valuable piece of work around what is value, what is value and how do we create change with this work that we still use now. And then once we had some sort of, some bigger investment into the evaluation process, we were able to test out some really interesting ways of thinking about, tracking change and progress and what we would expect to see and how would we know. So we'll get into a little bit of that in this conversation. Is there anything else you wanted to draw out from this slide in particular?
I think the only bit that I'd re-emphasize is we had some data. Go back to those 7 years. We had some data on the right hand side, didn't we? And the starting point then, as you've already touched on, was, well, how do we get from what we do to whether it's going to change that data on the outcome in some way? And so just filling that middle bit in is one thing, isn't it? The fact that we've got examples now, not just in Greater Manchester, but we've got examples of trying to fill this middle bit in now across the country, which I think is great. But it, just that length of time, 7 years ago, we've now got something that we're working on to see what it tells us. I think is an important point for people to just hang on to.
Yeah. And I think just in terms of the data, the questions that we would have been asked and would have been asking ourselves 7 years ago, when we saw a change in data in terms of, say, active lives data or inequalities within that data, were quite, let's say, basic back then. Crude, maybe is a better word, where the data would come out and there'd be a whole set of questions and reflection on what was making that change happen in one place or another place during a particular period of time. And we're asking ourselves much better questions now, more sophisticated questions about the system conditions in the place, as well as the aggregation of all of the activities and the work that people are doing is understanding with a much wider lens on what's influencing inactivity, which we talked about last time. So should we move on to the next one? Because this was the blank sheet of paper that I worked with you guys then and the sort of revaluation collective in 2018, I think it was. We did a really small piece of evaluation work really early on, which is so important. We had a small budget, a set of stakeholder interviews, conversations with people in rooms with teams, using this revaluation tool, I would call it. You could call it a methodology or a model. I think it's a really practical tool for storytelling and understanding what's going on. And the big shift that this work helped us to make in the system was understanding that value is much more than the stuff you can count or calculate. And that opened up a whole different space in our mindsets around value and change. And that has helped to sort of really, give us a bit of a foundation for the kind of the bigger and the ongoing research and evaluation that now is embedded right across our work through commissioned work with the likes of Sheffield Hallam University and Substance, who we work with on some quite big pieces of work, but also the way that evaluative kind of practice is designed into our everyday way of being in the work, both in our team and with organisations that we're working closely with. I'll just pause there because you brought reevaluation to this work back then. So what are your memories of kind of what happened there and how it helped?
I wouldn't necessarily say brought, but I was part of the Press Red was part of the work with the Andrews of trying to look at how you use the tool, and I think tool is the best description for it. When this came up, the first thing that popped into my head was language and just how the challenge we had with trying to get this across to people at the time. But when we did, the kind of conversation it created probably blew my mind, and the stories that people told of how they connected moving more and movement generally to such a wide range of stories. That was the bit that I can remember coming from this work and just thinking how radically it had shifted my view of what we need to value in work in complex systems. That was, I think, the power of this. You start to get to that bottom row and you really start to think about the network and the power of networks and what they then go on to do in relationships that you can no longer see. You might even not have seen the fact that people have connected. You may or may or not, and then they go on and make things happen. And it just really shifted my own view of really what we needed to start to try and get other people to see. And those early workshops trying to use it in Greater Manchester, you know, they were, you know, you used what was the word you used earlier? Crude. You know, they were attempts at trying to put this into practice, weren't they? And the learning from trying to do that was, yeah, brilliant.
I think the other big thing it helped was, you know, the game-changing thing was helping people to recognize that just because something was invisible, it didn't mean to say it didn't happen. And I only just had a conversation yesterday about that with somebody who there was a whole load of change happening in a room, and then that reassurance that I could offer that the ripple effect of the change that was going to be created outside of the room that they would never see and never be able to attribute to their actions or their you know, their interventions in that conversation will, you know, you just have to trust and know that that happens all the time. And that is part of the value and is absolutely a driver of change in behavior and systems. So it was, I mean, it was quite hard at the time, I think, to bring this in, but I'm so glad we did, because it's still, I mean, our team now use it all the time in a way that back then felt quite hard, because it's almost like the work wasn't ready for it and the people weren't ready for it, but it's become a really embedded part of the way we think and the way we work as a team, which is great. So that was the starting point. And I know that people are craving, I was only asked yesterday by somebody for a kind of explanatory video about how you actually workshop with that tool and how you you know, how you really use it in practice. And so that's something else that we will go on to do, is almost like the how-to guide to using it, and then what you do with the data that comes out of it as well. But we'll move on because I think you've alluded to this in the first slide, but the really powerful thing that has come out of all the research and is continually sort of stress tested and refined. I think I mentioned this on the last video, the kind of the program theories that were generated from the early work of the local delivery pilot with the Substance and Sheffield Hallam consortia, through that sort of realist evaluation approach with the embedded researchers, and has continued to be refined over the last sort of 6 years, has led to these enablers for change, which are so useful to help us understand what needs to happen, whether that's in a piece of work or whether what's happening in a piece of work or what's happening and changing in the system or in a place. And in the context of today's conversation, those conditions that we are sort of tracking are we capture data on them on an annual basis in all 10 localities and across the GM sort of layer of the work. And they help us to understand what's changing. So this is the data to 2022. So there's another set of data beyond this from last year's survey, which I can share as well. But what this is really helping us to understand is the extent to which there's a set of statements that people right across the system are kind of answering questions on a survey about how mature are we in this respect. So how mature is the local system in involving local people and growing assets? To what extent is it an established way of working to work across and between sectors? To what extent is strategic leadership enabling distributed leadership in this place or in this area of work? So one is that these questions and these enablers of change are used in a really strategic way to understand what change is happening in the system as a whole, but they also can really help us to do like monthly logs and reflective practice as a team on a particular piece of work or a priority area of a plan, and also within any sort of our own personal design about our own actions and our own work as individuals. So it's been hugely important to the story that we can tell as well about when we go and present this story of GM moving this into different rooms or in different reports. We can explain what's happening in terms of active lives data and inactivity and inequalities, and we can also look at that alongside what's changing in the system. So these two things are, and start to see track where the changes in system conditions are tracking with the changes that we're seeing overall in the population data. I'll just pause there. Is there anything you wanted to draw out from those slides?
Well, I guess the note that I was just scribbling down was, that whole, you can look at these indicators, observations, whatever you wish to call them, at a GM level, can't you? And you can look at that change between those two periods of time that are on there. But what I really liked about what you just explained is putting it into practice at an individual and team level. What does this mean to my work? What through my work, how do I contribute and influence what might be going on in some of these conditions? And I think that's a really, interesting way of starting to try and get our head around this work about actually putting this into practice, and using it to reflect and to think about and to problem solve and to build on strengths and all of that space. I think is a really helpful, consideration to just ponder at some point.
Yeah, and I think it ties back to the slide I used last week about the individual role and contribution to the overall organisational plan, to the overall strategy to unite the movement. These set of questions that you can ask around these enablers can work at any one of those strategic levels as well. And so, for example, if I was in a one-to-one with a member of the team, a conversation with a member of the team who was struggling or stuck in a place, it's become quite natural to ask questions that, be curious about to what extent any of these enablers are at play in that. And there might be one that we need to shift, and the one we need to, as you can see in the bottom right hand corner here, transforming governance and processes, is the one that we most routinely get stuck on. And so that's the thing that you can then pick at. And then you've got data, but you've also got people's own personal insights and reflections on, like, where are you getting stuck with this piece of work or this process, and what is it that we can draw from, either from the headline statements here, but also there's a set of descriptors, if you like, that sits underneath each one of these. So you could really go into the program theory and help you, thinking tool, really think what I might need to push at or pull at or do differently to unlock the potential of this process or this bit of governance. So a lot of this stuff is helping us to. It goes back to the first slide about the kind of mental models and the mindsets and the learning process. It's like a rewiring of a brain that asks different questions. For me, that's what it's become for me anyway.
And counts different numbers.
And counts different numbers. Yeah. Okay, so and going, I suppose just to sort of touch on the numbers there, we fortunately in Greater Manchester we get, and I'm going to pull on your expertise here because this is the work that you do for us with your team, is that analysis of the active lives data. These are the 4 government outcomes that we report on within United the Movement and the government strategy. We have, well, I'm going to pause actually. What are your reflections on how we use the data now compared to how we used it 7 or 8 years ago in Greater Manchester, and what are we? Are we still crude, or are we maturing?
We're beyond. I think we're much better able now to tell a more compelling story. We've got more parts to it than just plonking the physical activity data down in front of people, haven't we? And there's a lot of, as I said, that slide that we started with about the spheres of interest and the outcomes, and how we go from what we do to observing change in those outcomes. We've got slides to put around the data that helps tell a much richer narrative now. I do think we're using the data better than we used to, both visually and we've probably gone from 150 slides to 15 or 20, sometimes 40, depending on how carried away we all get. But I think we're just using it. We're using the information much more intelligently, I think, is probably the best way of describing it. And we're being given better tools, aren't we? Both nationally and locally, we've got better information. So it's moved on considerably. And I think, and we're getting more interested in it because we've got a greater sphere of people that are interested in working in this way and are looking at what they can take from this information. So it ripples out. Yeah, sure. I was smiling then because at the end of last week's session, I talked about going back to look at the slides that we used to use in 2017, and I did. It was a bit frightening. In terms of it was about the volume and the complexity of the information we were trying to convey. And what we've learned, I think, over time is that that you don't need to share and talk through all of the data in the conversations and in the rooms. We need to
be quite bespoke in the data we're bringing in, depending on the audience and depending on their area of interest and their role. I think back then probably used to think that we needed to show all the data because that was the way to convince everybody and persuade everybody that this mattered and this is what was going on. And actually, there's a lot more belief in the need for this work than we probably thought back then.
I agree, and I'd add to that we were also trying to convince people that we were rigorous and that we were paying attention and that we were building credibility, weren't we? And we were building trust, and we were we're showing that look, there's this rich data source out there that can help us. How do we use it? And look at everything it shows us. And I think over time, as people have become a bit more comfortable that we maybe know our onions and we're using it in the right way, that story's become easier and more succinct to tell.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was a big part of it back then, was an assumption that because there was data, we needed to use it all of the time to prove that we were, serious in what we were doing, and that we understood enough. And also, I think because perhaps look at it from a kind of population health data analyst perspective, and think that was about the volume of information that we needed to show we understood it in order to inform the work. I think just that takes me back to probably this slide, which I skipped over at that point, but that one of the things that we have learned a lot about in recent years is about, I think I mentioned before, like the head, speaking to the head, the heart, and the hands. So telling the story of the work, and isn't about telling all of the story all of the time. It's being able to make it bespoke to the audience, but that should include data in terms of, it might be program data, it might be feedback data, it might be qualitative research results, it might be case studies and stories and anecdotes and quotes. As you can see on here, this is from our last year's story of the work, our sort of annual report. But being comfortable and confident enough in the work and knowing that we've got reams of data, and then drawing out the story in a way that makes sense to people and is meaningful. So there's a layering of the sort of the active lives data analysis and the existing conditions work that we've just talked through, but then also being able to be quite specific and tell the story of a particular piece of work, or in the sake of walking grants, the number of grants, the number of people, the number of communities and organisations, the diversity of the audiences that the grants are reaching, the how the grants are distributed across the communities of Greater Manchester. That's all data and seeing and tracking the change in all of that over time, showing how we're getting better at targeting our resources to communities that need it most. So it's telling a different story. And then if we're telling a story of an individual who's gone from, say, inactive to active, as we would have said in the old days, it's not just telling the story of, oh, aren't they amazing? As an individual, they've gone from an inactive life to an active life through the walking programme. It's what are all the sort of conditions around that have helped that to happen. So there's a layering of the story alongside the data that helps us to understand like more of what's creating the change and making that shift. Anything on that one before we move on?
No, not really. There's all kinds of things going through my head, but we'll save them for another day, I think.
Skip on. Okay, so this sort of just tries to bring that together, really, in terms of uses a diagram in the middle of the key areas, the key sort of component parts of the GM Moving and Action strategy. We're always paying attention to what kind of data, what kind of research, what kind of evaluation and learning is going to help us to understand what's driving change in that system and in the population scale physical activity patterns. The one we've talked about most of these already. So the one that I would probably pay a bit more attention to is that top left one about the traces of change in language and culture and ideology and beliefs, because as we explained in the last conversation, that culture change area of work in that socio-ecological kind of onion layered model offers us such a massive opportunity to create the conditions for change. It needs a whole other set of evaluation and data tracking, if you like, to understand what's changing and why. And so this is quite an exciting and interesting area of work for us now, is to go, well, how would we know if change was happening in the system, and what would we track? And good example this morning from the combined authority meeting was Andy Burnham's sort of introduction to the or this kind of wrapping up of the conversation was about the active souls movement, and how people across the combined authority are able to wear trainers to work and shoes they can move in, and him recognizing just in a conversational way that was a trace of change in culture, and that you wouldn't have seen people. There's quite a number of people in the room who were wearing trainers with their suits, and you wouldn't have. His reflection is that you wouldn't have seen that 7 years ago. So there's all these examples. It blows my mind. You can see all these examples all over the place about how culture and beliefs and worldviews changing. I feel kind of guilty that I can't write them all down and capture that as data and evidence. So yeah, I just welcome your reflections on where we go next with that, really.
This is a space that I think is critical. I think seeing change in this part of our work is fundamental to really getting the big shift that I think we're looking for. And I think some of the work, and we'll come to the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership learning a little bit later or shortly. I think some of the work around explanatory accounts, explaining our work over a period of time and learning to make observations as we go. Could you imagine if we had those observations? We could take Andy's speeches, couldn't we, from over the course of all the GM moving conferences, and just look at the subtleties in the language and his own understanding. And we see it all the time, don't we? I've got a particular example going through my mind at the moment of some work I'm doing elsewhere in the country, of an individual who's really starting to get their head around this work and what it means to their organization, and the way that their language and their articulation of what they're going to do with what they now know has changed over the course of 6 months, 12 months is quite fascinating. And it's how do we start to document some of that? And I think we've got the techniques now, the ripple effect mapping, journey mapping, that whole space, and that concept of an explanatory account from our assumptions, and then thinking about how we continually make observations, I think is a good way. And key influences are a critical part of that, aren't they? Just watching how Andy Burnham's language has changed over time would be a really interesting meter for this, wouldn't it?
It would. Yeah. It's interesting. I think I just need to let go of the fact that I can't possibly capture it all.
It is impossible.
It's because just see so much changing, and I feel a bit like, if only I had.
Project forward 7 years, Hayley. Go back 7 years. We had a blank sheet of paper and some data about some outcomes. Project forward another 7 years. We'll have some ways of filling that gap in. I'm pretty sure.
So so that's interesting, because I think that leads on to this slide, doesn't it?
It does.
So do you want to talk us through what this is telling us?
Well, it's wonderful that we've got this. If you go back to a GM and the other LDPs, I know there are parts of the country that didn't have LDP investment, that have been trying to take whole systems, place-based approaches for some time now, starting with a blank sheet of paper and trying to work out towards that, filling the gap with the outcomes. And what we've got now is at least some pencil drawings on the piece of paper now, haven't we? Think about some of these, and this work that's coming out of the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership, it's brilliant. It's going to change. It's going to iterate. It's going to evolve. It's going to get stronger. But it's a really thought-provoking bit now for everybody to start to be thinking, okay, what does these things look like in my area? How do we start to take stock of them? How do we start to think about what we capture, how we capture our observations around how these 10 conditions are at play where I am, and how they may change over time? And that bit in the middle about the practices, I think are a wonderful thing for us to be getting our head around. Our work around integrating physical activity across all of the different sectors and systems that contribute to the influence, how we build on the strengths of people and communities, and really how we get to doing that work to tackle those structural inequalities, racism, sexism, misogyny, ableism, etc., etc., etc. Because it's in dealing with some of that we're going to get a different outcome for physical activity, and these conditions help us think about that. And it's just potentially, I think it's a real game changer for everybody. And I get excited about another 5 years and X many more places trying to work through this, and what learning will we have then? And that's a really exciting bit for me.
So just to explain then, so if you what does this help people to do? I suppose in a similar ways to I've explained the enablers for change for me and how they're used, and how valuable they become as a tool and a way of thinking. Is that kind of what you see the sort of art of the possible with this?
Yeah,
or is it something different?
I think it, for starters, it's a conversation starter, isn't it? Both the three practices in the middle, in terms of where do we spend our time. I know from some of the areas that we work in that we spend a lot of time in the top rung of that ladder on integrating physical activity across sectors, and possibly quite a lot less of our time on how do we start tackling structural inequalities. We've got to start thinking about how we put our time and what it means to practice across all three of those areas. I think the middle rung's got quite a lot of the middle space around strengthening community and individual capacities has got a lot of effort into it as well, but I'm not so sure how much the bottom part of this has, and that's where the greater change comes from. And it's harder, so it's understandable, but it helps us reflect, doesn't it, around where are we spending our time, because all three of these things are needed. And then the conditions themselves, one way is the GM way of actually, once you get the work established and you get that cohort of people working together and trying to create observations and thinking about, well, are they changing for the better or for the worse, these conditions over a period of time through the work that we do. But just talking about them, you get into some of those conditions and start to think in some of the places, well, what does this look like? What does a physical environment look like in some of our deprived communities where we spend a bit of time working with partners? And the answer is not as great as it should. It's as blunt as that. There's less indoor space. There's poorer quality outdoor space. It opens a conversation around what are these conditions like in our communities, and trying to think about and exploring different ways of using it. There's one way of, like you're doing of Great Manchester doing around scale of 1 to 7. What's it like now? How do we observe this over time? There's another way of talking about them, exploring them, keeping a qualitative explanation of whether we think things are changing. Alongside that, I think a mixture of both is possible as well, isn't it? The other, it's, for me, it's getting us to think about how we document and analyze, interpret, and make sense of a different form of intelligence that is about these conditions and these practices.
Yeah, I also think it's almost like a bit of a guidebook, isn't it? If you had a new, member of staff, you gave them this and you talked through each of them, so this is what you need to do. This is how you need to do it. Think about the other stuff that sits alongside it. And so it can both be a kind of reflective tool, an evaluation tool. It can be a conversation to open up, and it also can be quite a little bit of a how-to guide. And it brings together, doesn't it, sort of like the best the best of the stuff that we've got, because you can see in it, the GAPA interventions that work and the sort of building blocks of health. And it's bringing together quite a lot of things in quite a simple way, isn't it?
It is. And we've just got to practice, haven't we? we've just got to try and use it in our work.
Always practicing.
And, capture it.
Well, so I'm going to sort of bring the slides down there. Our email addresses are on there for anybody who would like to follow up or get in touch and join in the conversation or disagree with us on something. But I'll, kind of just pause to think about the conversation we had there. What's missing from it? What haven't we explored? Anything that's resonated, or do you think that we should think about next?
think that you touched on the reval. I think there's some tools, aren't there? I think that you explored brilliantly in the blog that I think it would be good to spend some time on at some point. I do think there's something in that. I think we mentioned this at the end of the last one around the leadership skills, abilities, qualities. That whole space, I think, would be worth a conversation, because it's throughout this, isn't it? There is an underpinning element to this, which is all about the skills and abilities that we need to enable as many people as possible to have to be able to create this kind of change, which I think we need to explore at some point.
Definitely, because I think, again, going back to if I had a new member of staff starting and I was going to use those conditions to go, this is what you need to do, and then there'd be another one which is, and this is how you need to do it. And that is daily conversations I'm in with people about how to go about this work, mindsets, behaviours, ways of working, but also how to stay resilient in it and how to look after yourself in it, is a big feature of the conversations I have. And then the other thing, so I think there's definitely a conversation to be had about the how and the ways of working. And the other thing that's on my mind, just to kind of take us a step on to the conversation we just had, is when you were saying, if we were in 7 years' time or 5 years' time looking back, what would we want to be in place and kind of embedded in our sort of day-to-day practice, that we're perhaps just on the front edge of now, but would become so embedded in as a way of working and understanding of change. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is, the national conditions around us have changed since we spoke last week. And, we have a new government, a whole new set of national conditions. That bit about tackling sort of the structural inequalities on the ladder, on the bottom rung of the ladder, I'd love to look back from the future to here and know that we understand more what's going on there and what is influenceable, what is it possible to influence, and also the extent to which the stuff that is within our sphere of direct control and influence, what have we learned about these ways of working, being able to shift, like the inactivity and inequality. It's got those two arrows, and they're kind of like, it's almost like a looped thing. Is I want to understand to what extent is it possible to intervene in that loop and make a kind of a virtual sort of upward spiral with, national conditions, local conditions, and then the role that we can play and the contribution we can make.
Yeah, well, Andy wrote a very interesting Guardian article, didn't he, on yesterday? Andy Burnham wrote a very interesting Guardian article yesterday about his meeting with the new Prime Minister, and there's a space there, isn't there, to explore around if you get greater power and devolution in city regions and so forth, what do we want to do with it? If that happens
Absolutely.
in the next 7
and I think we need to be
years,
and we need to be really clear about what our contribution to that is. We've got enough learning behind us to play our part in that, and that feels really exciting. As well, so 7 years on.
Sorry. The other thing that's just sprung to mind as I was listening to you is, whether people want us to. I think it'd be really good to paint a picture, like Bury or wherever it is, of just what that evaluation work looks like in practice.
In Bury, as in the place, not a Bury.
Yeah. No, one of the GM localities. We've talked about it, haven't we, at a GM level, and this work is so much more than GM at a GM level, and I think that'd be quite a helpful thing to maybe think about at some point, of what it looks like going into practice in places, in neighbourhoods, for us to just try to bring that to life.
Absolutely, and I definitely can't paint a picture of a Bury, but we can paint the picture of Bury, and that is entirely, that would be really good to sort of go into the layers then of what does this look like in a place. So we'll have to cajole some colleagues to come in and tell us.
I think that would be good. I think to just get broaden the conversation. I think it'd be quite interesting.
Brilliant. Okay. So there's three things we're going to do next, but I'm going on holiday first, so we'll
and then I'm on holiday after that, so it'll be 6 weeks time.